Hello and welcome to the shop. I've got a treat for you today. We're going to turn a European pen kit. First time I've turned this kit, and it's a special kit in that it is a fountain pen. And I do love fountain pens. So let's have a little fun. I'm ready to start making this European fountain pen. And one thing I noticed is the bushings, they say they're for a B mandrel. This is my mandrel, and when I stick the bushing onto the mandrel, you'll notice there's quite a bit of difference in size there, so the B mandrel must be a larger mandrel. I am not going to go out and order a new set of bushings for this. I'm going to go ahead and turn these between centers. I'll just turn the front half of the pen, I'll come back and turn the cap. We'll do them at 2 separate times, and we should be able to achieve the same results without having to spend the money for the B mandrel. Now, I chose a blank, and I'll be honest, I don't know what type of wood it is, but it's absolutely gorgeous. It's going to be a really nice looking blank when the pen is done. The center tubes require a V bit, so I've got that ready to go. So I'm going to start the process of preparing this blank to turn into a fountain pen. These brass tubes are the exact same length, so I really am only going to need one of them for this process. And I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to leave just a little bit of a lip at the end of the blank. We're going to mark our blank. We'll move the tube forward, mark our blank. Here are the marks I made on the tube, and you can see I left a little bit of meat on either end of the tube. And the reason why I do that, if I look at this blank, I can see that it's a little bit at an angle. So if I put this tube in there, put it straight in, you can see that the top of the tube sticks out where the bottom of the tube is flush against the blank. That's why I leave a little extra material. I can drill straight through, I can center the tube in the blank, and then I can square the end up on my sanding jig, and I don't have to worry about coming up too short. I'm over at my bandsaw, and a lot of times I'll use this jig. I don't use it properly all the time. I'll actually just take my blank and I'll lay it on the jig, kind of align the mark with the blade, and I'll just use it to push it squarely through the blade. But today I'm going to actually go ahead and set this jig up as an alternative method. Now what you do is you take this piece of, I believe it's Delrin, and you press it against your blade. You lay your blank in the back of the jig against the fence and press this little block over next to the blank. And you just tighten it down. Now what you've done is, if we take and move this piece to this side of the blank, I can run this through and cut a blank to the perfect length every single time. Now, I don't want to do that because you remember, take a look at this. You can see, even though the camera is not perfectly aligned with the blade, that there is about, an 1/8 inch gap between the line I drew and the blade. I want to make my blanks a little longer because my blank is not perfectly square. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to back this off a little bit. Just a fraction. Whoops, let me loosen that up just a little bit more. There we go. And I'm going to line it up this time with my blade. And then I'll go ahead and tighten this down. And now I'm going to test one more time. Since I'm doing this around the camera, I want to make sure that I get it square. And that looks really good. I'm lined up right with the blade. So let's go ahead now and let's cut our 2 blanks. Even though these blanks won't be perfectly aligned, one will be a body and one will be a cap, I'm going to go ahead and put a mark on here so that I keep the grain direction flowing in the same direction when the pen is capped. As I mentioned earlier in the video, I don't normally use this piece for this particular jig. While it is handy, what I will do a lot of times is I'll just move this block, this little set block, out of the way, and this lines up perfectly with the blade, so I can just eyeball my mark and run this through the blade and knock off the pieces of my blank one after another without any issue. Another thing I find myself doing is if I want to make repeated cuts, let's say I want, and we'll just kind of guesstimate here, let's say I want a 1 inch blank. This uses a 7/16 inch wrench. I'll tighten that down. I can put my blank in here, run it through the blade. Then I just basically knock that piece out of the way, put the blank back against here, run it through again and again and again, and repeatedly make 1 inch blocks of wood. I will put in the comments where I got this particular jig. It is extremely handy, and I use it all the time when I want to make repeatable cuts on my bandsaw. I've brought my blank over to the drill press, and I've chucked up my V-bit. Now, you could just as easily do this on your lathe if you happen to have a set of pin jaws and a chuck. I don't know how well you can see this, but right there is the mark that I made on my blank crosswise to keep the two halves going in the same direction. We'll just make sure that we drill, or we start drilling each of those blanks at that point, so that we get a nice matchup of the grain when the pin is assembled. Now, the grain is not perfectly going to match, because I can tell you on the cap, I have to turn a section of the cap down to the tube to insert the beauty ring, so we'll never get a true match with this particular pin. But this is a good process to get into, because there are many pins where, for example, slimlines, you're going to have a very close fit, and it's nice to have that grain pattern follow from the bottom blank to the top. Now, one thing that I did not do, which is also a really good practice, is before you start drilling, it's always nice to mark from end to end and find the center point of your blank. And then with a punch tool or a nail, you can put a little dot there. That'll let you start perfectly dead center of the blank. That is super important if you have a blank that has a pattern in it. Say you were doing a Celtic knot, you would want to make sure you were starting dead center. On a standard wood blank like this, it's not as important. The critical thing is that you drill straight through the blank and do not come out, the side of the blank while drilling. I'm ready to glue the tubes into the blanks, and I've got my work area kind of set up here. First thing we're going to do is we're going to take our tubes and we need to rough them up. So I've just got some sandpaper here. It's just an old piece, but it's good enough to put some serious scratches into the brass tubes, which is what I need for the epoxy to be able to better stick to those tubes. And you can see how quick that was. I'm going to go ahead and rough the other one up. You might be wondering what this little red ball is. Well, it's actually just Play-Doh. I picked this tub of Play-Doh up, I think, for 50 cents at a local store. And what I like to do is I'll roll a ball up and I'll force the tube into the ball. And what that does is that plugs the end of my tube. We'll roll the Play-Doh back up into another ball. And we'll put the second tube through there. And what this is going to do for me is whenever I go to pressing these tubes into the blanks, and they've got epoxy all over them, I like to push them into the blank and kind of pull them out and rotate them to spread that epoxy really well. This keeps the epoxy from getting into the end of the blank. You don't want that to happen, because then you have a difficult cleanup, number one, and number two, you can change the inner diameter of the blank, which could possibly make your pin components not fit well if it's too large, or if there's an bit of epoxy in there and you put this onto your bushings, it could throw your blank off center, which means you might get a blank that has like a little fingernail on one side and is below the bushing on the other. So it's a good idea to fill the ends of your blank with something, and Play-Doh is super cheap. I've seen people use potato. I've seen people use wax. There are all types of things you can use, but just be sure to plug those to keep the epoxy out of your tubes. I put down a couple of strips of blue painter's tape on my work surface, and this is just to protect the work surface from the epoxy and to make cleanup super easy. You can see I've squirted out a little bit of resin and roughly an equal amount of hardener. I just want to start mixing. This is a 5-minute epoxy. It is Loctite epoxy. That's just the brand that was available to me at my local hardware store. I don't know that one brand is better than the other. I'm sure there are some debates on that, but I have had wonderful luck with the Loctite epoxy. Now what we're going to do is pick up one of our tubes, and this is the end with the Play-Doh, so that's the end that's going to go in first. I'm going to spread a little bit of epoxy on the tube. You'll notice my mark that I made. That is the center of my blank. I want to start there. We're going to press the, you see how I'm pressing the tube into the blank. I'm going to add, or actually I'm going to move this epoxy up just a little bit. Make sure we got plenty on there. We're going to flip the blank over and we're going from the other end. And you can see by doing this, you can see the epoxy smashing on there. That's what I'm trying to avoid getting inside of my tube. You do not want that inside of your tube. Just going to push and I'm going to push that tube all the way to the center. There we go. It's just below center. And let me see if I can get some of that epoxy off of there. Probably should not have used my my tool for that, but that's all right. We're going to set this aside to dry. Actually, what I'll do is I'll go ahead and poke the Play-Doh out, because the Play-Doh potentially could have a little bit of epoxy on it, and it could end up epoxying into the end of the blank. So with that pushed out, we're just going to set that aside to dry. And now we've got our other blank. This is our center. So we're going to grab the blank, get some epoxy. Let's go ahead and feed it in. And just rotate it as you put it in and get that epoxy spread all over the inside of that blank. The better spread of epoxy you have, the better adhesion you're going to have between the tube and the blank. Now we'll go through the back side of the blank. Wow, there we go. I'm just going to rotate that up to where it's right at the end. We'll wiggle our tool out of there. Let's take some of the excess epoxy off the end of the blank. Go ahead and poke our Play-Doh out of the blank. And we'll be fine with that little bead of epoxy. It is not inside of our tube. And when I square this on my sanding jig, it will clean that right off. So these blanks are ready to dry, and we're just going to leave them overnight so that we have a good solid adhesion between the tube and the blank. We talked about cleanup. I'm just going to grab the stick. We'll just grab our tape, and as we roll it, I'm going to toss the Play-Doh inside of the tape. There's our stick, and this can go right in the trash can, and you can see my work surface has not been affected.